Welcome, everyone, and thanks for stopping by the 2018 QPP Proposed Rule Insights presentation today. For those of you who I haven't had an opportunity to talk with over the course of the last few years, I'll give you a brief summary of my background in healthcare. One of the things that I've done over the course of the last 20-plus years, and as the years go by, I start to lose count of the years. I'm sure there are many of you on the line that are the same way, but I've started out at a call center in a patient accounts area and worked my way through the trenches of all the various areas of what we call our cycle of AR life, and have a really strong background in the financial and revenue cycle side of things, and have been doing consulting for the last 5 years with some amazing groups. I'm sure many of you are on the line with us today. So that's just a little bit about myself. And again, I welcome you to today's Insights presentation. We thought we would take a few minutes just to talk a little bit about the 2018 QPP proposed rule and kind of what it means for those of us who were eagerly anticipating jumping into MACRA and MIPS this year. I'm sure many of you are nodding yes, we're so excited. But based on the conversations that I've had with many of you that have been around as long as Meaningful Use and PQRS and MIPS and MACRA, QPP, I mean, one popular opinion jumps out, and that is that we are so over the number of acronyms floating around, and we've had our fill. And the second piece that seems to be overwhelming as I talk with groups is that it just kind of feels like Groundhog Day, right? We have a finalized rule, we're kind of making our plans and what we're going to end up doing, and along comes the proposed rule, and we wait on the edge of our seats to see if they're going to approve the proposed rule or not. So, each year we're anticipating our timelines, our strategies, we're developing our project plans based on those finalized rules. And by the way, we've had to sift through those rules to come up with those plans. So midway through, they toss us the proposed ruling, and we know that they may or may not accept that final rule. But it is encouraging, at least to myself and for a lot of people that I've talked with in the industry, that CMS is listening to the feedback from stakeholder organizations, clinicians, support staff, all with the goal to improve the policy finalized in what they're calling the transition year. And that's really what this is. This is a transition year into the MACRA and MIPS. So that being said, bear with me here for 1 second. There we go. All right, so CMS just basically restated that it is a benefit, the proposed rule itself is a benefit to practices to offer that greater flexibility for participation. So, keep that in mind. And this from the administrator, by the way, at CMS, who has said that we've heard concerns that there are too many quality programs, technology requirements, and measures that get between the doctor and the patient. And by proposing this rule, their aim is to improve Medicare by helping doctors and clinicians concentrate on caring for their patients rather than filling out the paperwork. So, they've heard it. Those of you that have spoken up and taken the opportunity to comment during that comment period, that was her response to some of the things that they've heard. As part of the proposed rule, one of the biggest things that jumped out of that proposal was the increased Medicare threshold. So many of you are familiar with the fact that CMS initially in the final rule had set those thresholds to 30,000 in Part B charges or 100 Part B patients. And in that proposed rule, they've increased that threshold for low volume to 90,000 and 200 Part B patients. That's an either or. And what's that impact? So the impact that's projected is that that's going to exclude 585,000 plus clinicians. And some of the other exclusions are going to impact another 390 clinicians. So when you look at that, that's going to leave 37% of the population eligible to participate in MIPS. for the 2018. Again, it's proposed, but if we do that math, look at that percentage. That is 63% of Medicare clinicians that would be exempt from MIPS in 2018. And so as we talk about, lesser population of folks that are participating in MIPS, that means lesser penalties potentially. And so everyone's asking the all-knowing question of what does that mean for the possible incentives? And there's not an easy answer to that just yet. But that being said, the whole overall goal is to ease the burden. And that means that there are going to be several small wins for small practices. And the impact of MACRA will be mitigated for those small practices, despite the fact that the complexity of the program is a little bit higher than what it was in meaningful use. But then you then mitigate that for some of the smaller practices. And then also, for what it's worth, some of the rural programs, the HIPAA shortage areas, those practices seem to be those that would be potentially more impacted than others. And I mentioned this earlier, there is going to be a smaller pool of penalty dollars to fund for the high performers. And the fear is that could potentially discourage small practices, large practices from participating. So I don't know if you guys have had a chance to kind of, determine what that potential impact for you would be, or what your potential participation might be for 2018. There are some things to consider, though, on the plus side of that. And that is that, along with some of these other proposed changes that we're going to talk about, there are some additional incentives. So let's talk then about the proposed 2015 certified EHR change. And that is that, number one, it's going to be optional. And the 2014 certification can be used for the 2018 year. And you still have the opportunity to move to that 2015 edition, and we'll talk a little bit about what the recommendation might be. But from a full year of reporting, it is now proposed to do a 90-day period. Many of us aren't surprised by that because it seems to be that that's what they propose each year and they accept each year. And so here we are with 90 days on the table. And that does, give us some breathing room for some groups who maybe were stressing about the full year. And you can also delay moving to that 2015 edition until 2019. I'd like to point out, though, even though it's proposed to allow that continuation of the 2014 edition of your certified electronic record, many of the EHR vendors have been very hard at work to develop those 2015 edition applications for the finalized rule. And because there are no guarantees that that proposed rule would be accepted, they have had to push ahead and be ready. So that being said, we've seen vendors that have done a really good job of more easily capturing data. If you're not sure kind of what changes your vendor has made, I recommend that you reach out and ask your vendor what those changes are that would impact and more easily allow you to facilitate capturing the metrics. And then to kind of go a step further with that, being around and talking with a lot of the groups and practices, we've seen some practices that have been very successful over the years with meaningful use. And some of those most successful practices are those that didn't wait until the final hour to execute that project plan. So if you have the 2015 version available from your vendor, allow yourself that time to implement it. Get the 2015 version, for example, into your test environment. Review, what your measures and activities are going to be and where that data will be captured. Make any adjustments now. And that way, at the end of the day, you've taken advantage of the additional time that they've allowed. The goal of the proposed ruling, again, is to provide you some additional time and to relax that a little bit to allow you to be successful. So at the end of the day, providers who do use that 2015 edition, they're going to have an opportunity to get a 10% bonus from that. So again, while they say, listen, you don't have to do it now, the recommendation is really to at least have that plan in place, get the timeline on your side, and to at least make strides to get there sooner rather than later. For those in the CPC Plus programs, they are still going to be required to use the 2015 cert in 2018 for a full year, starting 1/1. So if you fall into that category, definitely want to make sure you have your timeline in place and that you can see the finish line. There, at this time, is no change, by the way, for participants in the Medicaid program. The Medicaid meaningful use did not change for this proposed rule, and they are going to try to shift that to, get more in line with the MIPS programs and the meaningful use requirements. They're going to try to join those all together. But as of right now, there are no changes anticipated for the participants in the Medicaid meaningful use program. Also, hospital-based physicians. They've included in the proposed rule that they can be assessed on their quality and cost in the context of those facilities where they're rendering their services, and they can also submit the inpatient value-based score to help calculate into their individual score. I'm not sure how many of you on the line are familiar with the link for CMS on their QPP site. And by the way, if you don't have that link or you're not sure what I'm referring to, please feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll send that link your direction. But basically, you're plugging in your NPI and you're looking at what your MIPS participation requirement is. And if you looked at that site very early on, you would have seen just a simple, yes, you're MIPS eligible, and yes, you must participate. And since then, they have added some special status designation on that site. It's actually kind of interesting because I've noticed that a lot of the clients and groups that I talk with and I'm working with, they have some special statuses, and now it's kind of clear on that site. For instance, some of those special statuses is non-patient facing. The other one is hospital-based, which is why I bring that up now. If you have that designation, then this change in the proposed rule would impact you. Also, if you are designated as a small practice, that's indicated on that site for you, as well as whether or not you are in a rural area or part of the HIPSA group. So you may want to circle back around to that site and look at some of the special designations that they've added for you. The pick your pace, that does not change. That will continue in 2018. Now, there have been some proposed revisions. For instance, the scoring for the quality category retains that 3-point floor that was imposed in 2017 out of the 10 possible points. And the second revision to that is that the overall performance threshold or benchmark will increase from 3 to 15 out of a possible 100. So again, that's what they've proposed in that revision. And then, of course, we have the cost category in 2018. So, 0% of that overall MIPS score in 2018 is what they're looking at. But that changes very quickly. So in 2020, that's going to jump up to 30% of your overall MIPS score. So if you haven't started looking at how to gather that data or develop a strategy for the cost category, that's something that you want to begin doing now. Again, for 2018, 0% of the overall MIPS score, but that jumps up pretty quickly on you. So keep that in mind. And for 2018, that quality category is going to account for 60% of your score. Referring back to a couple of slides ago, we talked about the fact that we don't know what the risk is, but we don't know what the possible incentive dollars will be out there because, of course, you've excluded a lot of the practices from having to participate. But they have given you, based on some of these proposed changes, opportunities to capitalize for additional incentives based on either A, doing the full MIPS, and B, qualifying for the exceptional performance bonus. Also proposed, and this is kind of interesting, I'm not sure, I'd be curious to know how many of you that are listening in may be impacted by this, but for 2017, you have one mechanism to submit your data, and that's for all of your categories. In 2018, what this proposed rule does is it says you can submit through multiple submission mechanisms. And, where I say that typically becomes important is you may have, 5 of your quality measures that you easily can capture through your EHR, but you also have 5 that not as easily can be captured, and therefore you might want to report those through a registry. And though in 2017 that's not something that they have allowed for, they have made it possible for 2018 in the proposed rule. So, that just gives you some flexibility that if your EHR doesn't give you that ability to pull that discrete data very easily, that you have some options there. And this is a very interesting piece. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the virtual group option that they've put into place, but obviously we knew that we could do MIPS as individuals, and we knew that we could do MIPS as groups. What is new, however, in the proposed rule is a virtual group. And we won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but for those of you who are a part of a solo practice or are a solo practitioner, or you have a group of 10 or fewer eligible clinicians and you feel like you would benefit by partnering with another group who also fits the same criteria, they are allowing you to form a virtual group. So if you feel like that's something that you may fall into a category for, there are some important things to know. And the first one is you can't decide after the fact that you want to become a virtual group. You do have to take the necessary steps to get that approval beforehand. And that's probably the most important part of that. So again, we won't spend a lot of time on that, but if you do have a situation where you feel like that's something that you have an interest in and you have some questions, I'm happy to answer those. If you send me an email, I'll get you some additional information on that. And then, of course, we have some hardship exemptions. Practices with 15 or fewer clinicians are offered the significant hardship exemption to opt out of MIPS ACI. There's some things to know about that, however, and for those of you who aren't familiar with all of the ACI, that's for your Advancing Care Initiative. If you do opt out of that, it's very important for you to understand that you're shifting then that score of 25% to your quality category. So be very careful when you consider whether you want to go that route or not. A clinician could apply for that exception if there are overwhelming barriers that prevent the physician who's eligible for MIPS from complying. Those details, by the way, have not been finalized. They are still kind of working that out, but they do want to make sure that they offer you the ability to apply for that exception. And then, of course, we have the advanced APMs. Those regulations would largely remain unchanged in 2018. A couple of the things that, kind of jumped out on the radar is that the CPC plus participants that have more than 50 clinicians in their parent organization can remain as an advanced APM in 2018 and beyond. But for the first time, they also outlined critical details that are going to, apply to that 2019 implementation. Again, they say, hey, we're going to create these. We're going to create this outline, but it's not ready yet. And that happens sometimes during the proposed ruling. But more importantly, I put it out there for this group that are participating in an APM, simply because if that's your goal, you need to kind of watch for some of those details as they develop. So that's a little bit about what we see in the proposed ruling. I'm going to take a look here real quick and see if we have some questions. I did have a question that came out asking where the calculations came from for the number of eligible clinicians that no longer will be eligible. Those actually came from CMS, and they're using their current data that they have available to them. So thank you for that question. Are there any other questions out there? I didn't see any other questions come across through the chat. As Jan mentioned earlier, We are happy.
We did have a couple,
Jen.
actually.
Oh, okay,
yep.
Perfect.
Yep. All right. There are two.
And Jen,
first.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. The first is, if we attest as a group in 2018, are we required to attest as a group in 2019?
The best answer that I have for you on that is, number one, use that resource that I mentioned earlier to see if they show you as MIPS eligible. And again, the data that's there right now is based off of the final rule. So if that proposed rule goes into effect, obviously that's going to change your status on that site. I always say CMS is your best determinant in terms of whether you're required to participate or not participate. But yes, if you are designated as a MIPS eligible provider, you do have to participate in some way according to your pick your pace.
Okay. And number two, if you have many doctors who are exempt from MIPS, is it wise to attest as a group and go for a positive adjustment, or hold off reporting until 2019? A lot would depend on the background of your group, your specialty, non-facing, what your volumes are. There's a lot of things that I would consider with that. If you would be happy to send me the details, I can kind of give you a really good response based on some of that additional information. But I would say that, definitely there are ways to look at, what that number looks like for you as a group as opposed to your individuals. And there have been cases where some of the group reporting has benefited the group as a whole, bringing up some of those individuals. So I would need some additional details from you to try to help you determine that, but certainly we could look at that for you. All right, and I think that does it for the questions that were in the chat. Please, everyone, feel free to write down the information here on this slide and contact Shauna with any other questions you have. She is a wealth of information about this. So thanks for coming this afternoon, and please be advised there will be a recording of this available on our website, and have a wonderful afternoon.